At 5,000 meters above sea level, the world feels stripped to its bones. The air in the Makalubaran National Park was thin enough to make each breath a small victory, and the landscape stretched in stark contrasts. Razor-edged ridgelines against an endless white sky, valleys sunken in shadow, rivers locked under plates of ancient ice. This was the kind of place where myths felt at home, where the unseen could walk just out of sight, leaving whispers in the wind. Samantha Hayes had been chasing a whisper for 3 years. 27 years old, a wildlife biology graduate from Oregon, she had abandoned the familiar patterns of a research assistant's life for something far less certain: the pursuit of the Yeti. She had read every account, studied every blurred photograph, combed through every contradictory scrap of testimony that pointed toward this remote corner of Nepal. The locals called it Mitokongmi, the man-bear snowman. Tourists liked abominable. Samantha preferred to think of it as undiscovered. Now, with the monsoon season creeping in early, she was hiking alone, though not by choice. Her small team of 3 had been forced to turn back 2 days earlier when one of them fell ill from altitude sickness. Samantha had stayed, stubbornness outweighing caution. She told herself she could manage. She told herself that solo expeditions were more efficient. That morning, the clouds had started to stack on the horizon like slabs of slate, and the wind carried a taste of snow. She pushed higher along a faint yak trail, her boots crunching on crusted ice, her pack heavy with gear she refused to abandon. She knew there was a cluster of caves marked on the map, refuges for shepherds in summer and for Himalayan brown bears in the colder months. One of them would shelter her from the approaching storm. By late afternoon, the temperature had fallen sharply. The first flakes fell, slow and deliberate, and the wind found seams in her jacket. The entrance appeared just as daylight began to fail, a dark, jagged mouth in a sheer wall of rock, half veiled by snow-laden rhododendron branches. Inside, the air was still, the ceiling low enough to force her to crouch at first. Her headlamp beam caught glimmers of moisture on the walls, old soot stains near the mouth. She set her pack down, lit her small camp stove, and tried to make herself believe this was just another night in the mountains. It was while she was collecting snow to melt for water that she saw it. The footprint was near the back wall of the cave, in a patch of silt left by a recent thaw. Human in shape, 5 distinct toes, but elongated, the arch wrong, the heel narrow, and deep, too deep for a barefoot human in such fine sediment. She stared at it, the beam of her headlamp trembling slightly with her pulse. She told herself it could be a local villager. But villagers did not walk barefoot in snow, and the cave was hours from the nearest settlement. Her rational mind began cataloging possibilities: print distortion from melting, a bear track partially collapsed, some rare mountaineer passing through. But her body was already making decisions without her. She pulled on her heavier gloves, shouldered her pack, and began to follow the faint impressions leading deeper into a fissure at the rear of the cave. The passage narrowed, forcing her sideways, her jacket scraping rock. The beam of her headlamp swung in erratic arcs, catching pale mineral crusts, pockets of ice. The air cooled further. Then, abruptly, the walls fell away. She stepped into a chamber, and the smell hit her before her eyes could take in the details. A thick, copper sweet wrought muted by the cold. Her light passed over something pale on the floor. Then another, and another. They were bodies. 5 at least, maybe more, in various stages of preservation. The cold had slowed decay, but there was no mistaking the collapse of skin, the stiff curve of limbs. Some were clothed in hiking gear, others in the bright, patterned fabrics of local porters. A few still wore backpacks. One had a climbing harness half buried under frost. Samantha's breathing grew loud in her ears, misting in the frigid air. She took a step forward, then another, her light skating over faces locked in slack-jawed grimaces, hands curled as if grasping for something unseen. No wounds she could see, no blood, no torn clothing, just stillness. At the far wall, she saw an opening, low and dark, a tunnel leading further down. Near it, the footprints appeared again, fresher here, as if something had moved among the dead not long ago. She felt the urge to run, to get back to the main cave, to seal herself inside and wait for daylight. But the beam of her light was already probing the tunnel, and some part of her brain whispered that she was closer than ever to the truth. The wind outside rose to a howl, carrying the first full blast of the storm into the cave system. Snow began to drift across the entrance, muting the world beyond. She had time to turn back. She didn't. She stood in the threshold of the tunnel until the cold drove a decision through indecision. She keyed the voice recorder on her phone and spoke quietly, as if a lowered voice could avoid disturbing the geometry of the place. Haze, Samantha. Muckalubaran, coordinates approximate. Found a secondary chamber. Multiple human remains. No visible trauma. Evidence of repeated visitation. Prints along east wall. Human morphology. Elongated. Entering side passage. She listened to her own breath in the speaker for a second, then clipped the phone to her shoulder strap so the microphone would keep working if her hands needed to be elsewhere. The tunnel lowered until she had to crawl, pack scraping rock, hip belt catching. The air smelled of rock dust and something colder than air, an absence that felt like a presence. Her headlamp threw a narrow cone that made the dark beyond look intelligent. She paused when the stone under her palm changed from rough to smooth, flowstone polished by centuries of meltwater. Beyond, the passage widened again, and the floor sloped down to a shelf above an oval pit. She crouched and shone her light across the pit. At the bottom lay what looked like a bedding of grass and hides, now stiff with frost. Something had nested here, or staged here, or slept here, and she could not comprehend those verbs belonging to anything that had also stacked bodies. She backed away, every cell insisting that gravity had shifted and down was now toward the exit. On the floor near her knee lay a tuft of hair, caught on a seam in the rock, a bundle of coarse fibers, dark at the root, the shafts pale toward the tip. She fought the urge to pocket it unloved. She took a small evidence bag from her kit and teased the hairs inside with tweezers. The fibers were longer than any she'd seen on a human arm or leg, shorter than a yak's mane. She sealed the bag, labeled it, and sat perfectly still for 5 seconds, listening. The sound came from somewhere ahead in the maze, then everywhere, an exhale, deep and long, as if the mountain itself were breathing. The tunnel carried it, turned it, set it at her back. She clicked off the headlamp. Darkness layered over her like cloth. She listened again. The exhale came once more, followed by a faint rattle, like pebbles settling after water has left them. When she turned her light back on, the beam found only rock and frost and the endless particulate of air. She retreated to the bodies, tested herself by naming what she saw as she passed. Jacket, strap, boot, scarf, pack, hand. The act of naming made a procession of the dead, and the procession permitted her through. At the threshold of the main cave, the storm spoke in its own register, snow fleecing the entrance, wind worrying the rhododendron like a beast shifting in its sleep. She went to the mouth, looked out, and understood that the world had simplified to 2 options: risk the exposure of the high trail and die in weather, or wait in the cave and attempt to remain a mind with choices. She chose the cave. She built a small fire of hexamine tablets and twigs dried near the ceiling, set her stove to work on a pot of snowmelt, and ate 2 mouthfuls of a bar that demanded chewing she did not have. She checked her sat messenger. The screen blinked through 2 bars, and then cleanly to none. No send. She wrote with a pencil on her field notebook. Bodies. Elongated human print. Secondary chamber with bedding. Tuft of hair. Collected. Storm inbound. Remain. She lasted 2 hours before the noise returned. It came again as the long exhale, but closer, and with it a vibration like a footfall mediated by stone. She turned her lamp toward the back and saw, not the thing itself, but its consequence, a new scuff of silt at the edge of the corridor, as if the earth had taken a breath and changed its mind about where to settle. She told herself it could be meltwater. She told herself many sensible things that retreated like animals when she stood up. The lamp lit the immediate, not the distant. Her hands moved slowly, because slow hands made the world slower. She reached for the longest object she had, a trekking pole, and failed to imagine the pole as a weapon. In one of the bodies, a strap had frozen across a chest like a sash. She looked for living mechanics in the dead pose and found none. The cold had taken them into its design. "You're inventing," she said out loud, because her own voice could sometimes announce a return to ordinary. The echo returned the word inventing and then let it fall. When the exhale came a third time, she decided she would not wait for the fourth. She pulled on her gloves, packed her bag with the efficiency of someone who wanted to be anywhere but here, and went to the entrance. The storm had sealed the mouth to a narrow slot, a crust of snow slabbing downward as if the mountain had grown a lid. She dug with her gloves until skin stung, and then with her metal mug until her fingers halted at the edge of pain. The slot widened an inch, then another. Wind found her face as a knife opening a letter. She judged the gap as passable, turned sideways, and began to worm out, pulling her pack behind by a strap. Snow poured in around her collar and down her spine. The world beyond was indistinct, white piled upon white, a sky smudged to metal, no horizon to claim. She stood, tilted into the wind, and took one step, then another. The ground fell quickly. Drifts disguised ledges. What looked like a flat became a cornice. She retreated, heart racing, and bent into the cave again because the cave was cruel, but it was knowable. Night came early because storms do that to time. In the dark, sounds sorted themselves into a taxonomy. Wind, water drip, the shift of snow as it sloughed from the rhododendron, the tick of cooling rock. Beneath all of it, intermittently, the breath. She fashioned a barricade with her pack and a fallen slab, and understood the silliness of barricades built before unknowns. She strapped the sat messenger to her shoulder and set it to a mode that, when it found the sky, would send a breadcrumb. She lay on her side to make herself smaller to fear and fell in and out of sleep like someone entering a lake. She dreamed an old travelogue image of the Pangboche hand. Photographs in the book she had read at 19, skeletal fingers wrapped in yak hide, offered by a monk with an expression in which patience and grief were friends. In the dream, the hand was not a hand, but a map, for fingers pointing to mountain passes and the thumb bent toward the cave. She woke to her own breath locked halfway and the realization that silence had replaced all the storm's registers. The world beyond the mouth had gone still, no wind, no sift, only the cold humming in the teeth. She lit the stove, made tea, and held the cup in both hands like a small animal. Her lamp lit the periphery of the dead once more and found details it had not the night before. An amulet on a string around a porter's neck, a blue bead caught in the fringe of a scarf, a laminated card with a weathered face, and the words trekking permit. She took photographs sparingly because batteries are a currency. She placed each image alongside the sentence in her notebook that would make it a fact later. Permit name winter faded. Amulet copper. Stamp design unknown. Blue bead plastic. Modern. She went to the secondary corridor again because not going made her more a listener than a person. In the small space, the air felt recently moved. She did not see prints, but she saw where prints could be. At the shelf above the pit. She crouched and shone her light again on the bedding. On the edge of the nest lay a knotted strap, a human object held in a non-human way, or a human object set down by a human in a place they had decided was secret. She took a photograph, and the flash whitened the air and returned light to her eyes slowly enough to feel like a missing. It was then that she heard, in the tunnel beyond the pit, a sound that convinced her of two contradictory truths at once: that something large was in the dark ahead, and that it was not moving toward her. The sound resembled an animal clearing its throat to breathe. She turned off the light again, not to hide herself, but to allow the shape of the sound to draw a shape of the place. For a count of 30, she let her eyes be useless. In the 30th part of a second after 30, a glow formed on the rock across from her like light through a palm, warm, human shade, but without a source she could name. It flared and vanished, leaving only afterimage, a broad arch of shoulder, a head carried forward, arms long enough that the imagined hands would touch the floor if they were hands. She did not scream, not because she was brave, but because terror removes sound before it can leave. She crawled backward, hit her hip on rock, and only later noted the bruise. The light of the headlamp came back in a panicked circle and found nothing where light had been. She stood in the chamber of bodies again and realized she had been counting her steps without knowing. 12 from shelf to turn, 8 from turn to threshold, 3 to corpses. She wrote 1283 in the notebook as if numbers could tether her. The day advanced, if that word applies where sunlight does not. Hunger announced itself as an argument she did not intend to win. She forced down half a bar, arranged her gear as if inventory could build a perimeter, and settled with her back against the wall by the entrance. Outside, the sky had a clarity that comes after storms, and light found its way into the first 10 feet of the cave, throwing into relief the drifting lacework of rime on the edge of rock. She thought about trying for the trail again. The idea felt like a sentence written in a language she could read but not speak. She slept, she woke, she wrote. She listened and learned that the long exhale had a pattern, 3 breaths at intervals too regular for wind, like a runner steadying, like an animal at rest. She began to imagine that the thing beyond would not come to her if she did not go to it, that notions of aggression were anthropologies carried into a place not obliged to obey them. And then she saw what imagination is good for, making any outcome a rehearsal. She stood with the headlamp off and said, "If you are there," in a voice she meant to sound neutral. Her voice returned the words you and there with small reverence, and that was all. At dusk, she tried the sat messenger again, walking to the mouth and turning the device toward a sky briefly cleared of violence. The unit blinked green twice and then returned to blank. It had tried to send a breadcrumb. Whether the sky had held it was not a thing she could discover now. She slept again and dreamed the river in the barren valley. A summer day, the moraine warmed, a child standing midstream hand in a parent's, the parent pointing to a line of footprints in soft, sun-melted mud. Toes forward, heel narrow, stride long. A pattern that made sense only as a pattern repeated. She woke with her mouth dry enough to cut and the impression that someone had passed through the chamber while she slept and arranged nothing but her certainty. Morning, in places like that, is a function of your watch. The storm had sealed the world again. She felt the pressure change in her ears before the snow like pressure in a train descending. The exhale came once, then not at all, and that absence carried its own shape. someone holding breath, something listening. She drank the last of the tea, put the notebook in her inner pocket where it would warm with her, and made the only plan left. Wait until noon, try the sat messenger again, and if it found Sky, leave a trail of words in its tiny mouth that would carry where she could not. Noon came as noon does, without permission. She crawled to the mouth and pushed her shoulder against snow and made a hole big enough to see Sky. The sat messenger blinked once and stayed green. She thumbed a preset, stormed in cave. Injuries, none. Found remains in subchamber. Coordinates approximate. Need extraction when weather allows. She watched the unit until blinking became a prayer. The light on the face steadied. Delivered. She did not know then that delivered would travel to a server in a city and sleep until wind in the high passes opened the relay. What happened in the hour after she sent the message had the structure of a story she would have written if she'd been someone else. The exhale resumed, closer than any prior, and resolved in the concavity of the back passage into a steady, low-paced respiration. She stood, headlamp low, and walked to the threshold. In the silt by the wall, a footprint appeared that had not existed before, pressed into the wet surface in the handful of minutes since she had watched the mouth for Sky. 5 toes. A pad the size of her palm laid twice over. A heel long and narrow. The stride between this print and the next would be too large for her to match, even by jumping. She did not know whether she was the sort of person who follows. She learned that she was. She stepped into the corridor, matched the width of the passage to her shoulders, counted the feel of stone under hands. 12, then 8, then 3. The shelf again, the pit again, the nest now unambiguous. The hair tuft remained in its evidence bag. Near the pit lay something new, an object set down, not dropped, a scrap of fabric, heavy, woven, the color of dirt. She picked it up, lamp close. It was an old swatch of blanket, the edge whip-stitched with a style she had seen on porters' bedding in lodges where the dining room smelled of kerosene and garlic. She put it back because ownership felt like a concept with penalties here. She rounded the bend beyond the pit for the first time and saw the passage angle down sharply, the floor glossed with a glaze of ancient ice thin as patience. Her left foot found nothing. She went down on her hip, slid 3 meters in a clang of gear against stone, and struck a shelf that stopped her and offered 1 more meter to end. She lay with one arm over the drop and looked into a hole that opened like a throat. The lamp beam fell and found no bottom before it ran out of power and distance. She scrambled up the shelf with the old memory of childhood. The fear that something under the bed would take hold of an ankle if an ankle hung too long. Her head struck rock as she sat up, and the small pain returned her to a simpler world of cause and effect. She took a breath, then another, tucked her head, and crawled back to the chamber on all fours because walking belonged to above ground. When she reached the bodies, she paused to let the fact that she had not fallen into a hole fill the space where panic had been. She held it until she could fold it and put it away. She went to the mouth a final time before dusk and saw a rectangle of sky the blue of porcelain and a shred of cloud like something torn. The sat messenger blinked again, delivered. She wrote a new note for no one yet. Second chamber, vertical drop. Hair sample secured. Unknown prints present within last hour. Storm abating. She signed with her initials because initials make language friendly. Night came back, and with it the sound. This time there was another texture under it, a faint percussive tap, irregular, as if a stick struck stone while wrapped in cloth. She thought of prayer wheels. She thought of the way an old man in Sedua had turned his wheel while telling her, in a voice without malice, not to go alone. He had said, "This place knows what you say when you think it is only yourself." She had smiled because the sentence was beautiful, and then she had gone anyway. Sleep was a series of doors in a hallway that kept reappearing. Through one she saw the barren glacier under sun. Through another, a table in Tumlington where a woman wrote names in a ledger. Through a third, an empty dining room at Kalmadanda with fog pressing all the windows like a face. Through the fourth, the cave again, but brighter, all the corpses sitting up quietly as if to make room for a guest. She woke with a cry contained in her mouth and the taste of metal on her tongue. Her lamp had gone dim. Battery halves checking themselves against the cold. She turned the light off and waited for nothing in particular. The exhale faded and did not return. After a time she understood she had been holding her breath again. She let it go, and with it a small piece of certainty that you are alone when you have decided to be. She thought about the winter seminar where a professor had said that cryptids are cultural heat maps. They show you where people's imaginations sweat. She looked at her notebook in the little light from her stove and wrote 3 words. It is colder. When dawn, her watch's dawn, came, she lined her gear, buckled everything that could be buckled, and decided to try the trail. The sky was pale and cloud-thin, enough for a helicopter if a helicopter had a pilot willing to thread a gorge. She did not know that the sat message had been seen at a workstation in Kathmandu and routed to a liaison who would call a number in Tumlington and wake a ranger who would wake a pilot who would watch weather over tea. She chopped through the new skin of snow at the mouth with the mug, and then with a flattish stone, widening the opening until she could push through. Outside the air was brutally clean. The world below the cave ran away in white corrugates toward the river's cut. She placed her boot in the first step and felt it hold. The second slid and caught. The third broke a crust and buried her to the hip. She leaned into the slope and dug her way up to a ledge. The ledge avalanched under her weight in a quiet sigh, and she rode it 5 meters into a hollow where the snow behaved more like sand. She flailed once, then held still, and the motion of her heart felt louder than the mountain. She made it back to the mouth by crawling, and there her body voted to be finished. She calloused the entrance with everything she could drag: fallen branches, chunks of ice, the slab she had used as a barricade. She switched on the headlamp one more time, and, in that suddenly kinder light, wrote a note on a page and taped it to rock where a rescuer's beam would find it before anything else. I am in here. Bodies in back chamber. Do not go alone. Tracks are. She left the sentence broken. It seemed right to leave some sentences as they had left others. She sat with her back against the wall and set the stove to the last of the fuel. When steam rose from the pot, she cupped her hands over it and put her face where the heat was and did not move it. 3 days later, when the helicopter found a weather window narrow as a letter slot, the pilot made the kind of decisions only pilots and surgeons make, committing to an approach with no safe go-around, letting wind decide whether a machine would be aircraft or stone. Rescue workers, 2 rangers from the Mucklebaran office and 2 local guides with the deliberate calm of men who moved in mountains for a living, were set down on a wind-scoured spur a half-kilometer downslope. They moved upslope in a traverse that traded danger for angle, not because they loved safety, but because they had families. At the cave mouth, winter had rewritten the architecture into an overhang and a slit, but the slit bore a dark seam that spoke of an inside. One guide, Nima, called, because to say a name into a hole is a kind of courtesy. In the silence after his voice, he heard nothing, which is sometimes more meaningful than sound. They widened the opening with shovels, then with gloved hands, then with the handles of shovels when hands numbed. The first light inside became a dull rectangle on a wall. The second light revealed the small taped note. Someone read it and stopped halfway through the unfinished sentence because names of things decide their own endings. They found her 10 meters in, propped against the wall, pack at her hip, stove under her hands like a shrine built on short notice. The expression on her face changed the temperature in the cave by a degree. Ice had fixed certain muscles in position, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, teeth showing in the way teeth do when the jaw has frozen between fear and the blank effort not to show it. The ranger closest had seen similar things and more terrible things and said thank you out loud, not to anyone in particular. He checked for a pulse because you do, then put a gloved hand on her shoulder as if to guide her somewhere. He took the notebook from her inner pocket because her note had told him where it would be. They withdrew a meter, 2, 5, 15. Their lamps licked the edges of the room where bodies lay beyond. They counted what they had to count and stopped when counting felt like inventorying a storm. Nima marked the hair tuft, the bedding in the side chamber, the shelf above the pit. He said a few words in Nepali that the rangers did not speak, but the shape of those words suggested they were not for the living alone. The extraction took the day. The helicopter made a second approach in wind that wanted otherwise. Samantha Hayes rose as a weight in a sling below the aircraft, spun once against the thin air, and then climbed the gorge the fast way while the men who'd found her descended on feet made slow by weather and the work of carrying more than bodies. At the forward operations hut, the medical officer did the respectful tasks. The notebook was bagged, her camera laid on moistened paper to dry. The SAT messenger showed 2 successful sends, time-stamped at noon on consecutive days, stormed in cave and second chamber. Items were logged. A radio call went to a liaison in Kathmandu, then to a number in the United States that put an ocean between knowledge and its cost. In the weeks that followed, the park and the police did the hard, small work. Teams returned to the cave to document the secondary chamber and the pit and the bedding with the boring, holy precision of people who refused to let the world remain unmeasured. The bodies in the chamber were not all new. Some had the dental work of people who had eaten in places with electricity for years. Others bore nothing to identify them, but bone and whatever stories bone could be made to tell. A permit card provided one name, a scarf pattern another. Phone cases remained, but no phones that would power on to speak. The tuft of hair in Samantha's bag went to a lab in Kathmandu, then a second in Delhi when the first reported a result no one wanted because it was not clean enough to publish and not dirty enough to ignore. Mitochondrial DNA sequences consistent with Ursus arctos isabellinus, the Himalayan brown bear. Nuclear DNA too degraded to confirm or deny. A third lab later suggested the hair might be from a domestic goat. A magazine summarized all 3 as mystery persists and put an artist's rendering of a yeti on the cover anyway, because that is what covers are asked to do. The footprint photographs spread faster than permissions. Some saw the long, narrow heel and said yeti. Some saw the toe splay and said frost-warped human. A Sherpa guide pointed at the arch and said, simply, wrapped foot, explaining that Highland smugglers sometimes bind feet in cloth to leave confusing tracks in fresh snow. No one could show a wrap that fit this print exactly. Many tried. The official report read as official reports do, dry, thorough, allergic to narrative. It documented the coordinates, the weather conditions, the last transmissions, the body count in the chamber, the observable features of the footprint near the back wall, the presence of bedding material, the hair sample, and its contradictory lab notes. It concluded that Samantha Hayes died of hypothermia and exposure after being trapped by weather in a cave system that also contained human remains of undetermined origin. It did not call anything a yeti. It did not call anything a murderer. It did not answer the question of how so many people came to lie in that chamber beyond reach of casual search. It did not explain the sound. Her family declined interviews. A small memorial appeared at the edge of a park boundary marker above Sidua. 3 prayer flags, a printed photograph of Samantha smiling against a backdrop of peaks, a smooth stone on top to hold it to the world. Locals walked past and folded the place into their own map of where to speak less loudly. In spring, meltwater changed the cave, as meltwater does. A slab fell from the entrance, widening it. Silt shifted in the back chamber, erasing some prints and revealing others. A ranger returning with a camera to complete a season's documentation noticed something at the shelf above the pit that had not been there before. A small stack of 3 stones, the kind children build when a beach is new. He photographed it because that is what he had come to do. He did not touch it because that is what he had learned not to do. In Tumlington, a woman who registered trekkers in her ledger remembered Samantha as polite, nervy, trying to pretend she was less determined than she was. She added a private note in the ledger margin next to Samantha's name, just a small dot of ink, because it was her way of telling herself that a person had passed through and that her passing had altered the page in a way the world could not. Up valley, in a stone house where the roof beams held stories darker than smoke, a man who had once seen, in a white field at dusk, a shape that rose to stand and then leaned away as if hinged at the hip, told the story again for the first time in years. He did not call it Yeti, because names invite argument, and he hated argument. He called it something that did not think it should be seen. He said it had breathed like a man at rest between tasks. He said he had not told the monks, because monks love an answer more than a question. On a late autumn afternoon when the clouds formed a shelf against Muckaloo's pyramid, and people in the tea house watched weather with the concentration some reserve for games, a rescue ranger who had cut the snow from the cave's mouth recognized a sound in his sleep and did not wake. In the morning he could not name it, but when he stood under the eaves and looked up valley into a light that felt thinner than it should, he had the sense that something had just left the edge of sight again, and that this, too, was a kind of seeing. A year later, a pair of hikers found a scrap of notebook page wedged beneath a stone at the edge of a melt channel above the cave. The edges had frayed to lace. The pencil lines held where they had been pressed hard. The words were Samantha's, recognizably hers to those who had read the rest. Do not go alone. Tracks are, the sentence ended under the stone. At a conference in Delhi, a biologist gave a talk on misidentification in the Himalayas and showed slides of bear prints refrozen into human-like shapes. In the question period, a young man raised his hand and asked if, given the data's ambiguity, the speaker believed in the Yeti. The biologist smiled carefully and said belief was the wrong tool for the question, then added, more quietly, that he had once been in a cave where the air moved like breathing without wind, and that he thought about that sometimes when labeling samples. On the kind of night when even the warmest towns in the valley fell silent early, a child looked up from a courtyard where someone was telling the old stories and asked whether the Yeti stood like a man or walked like a bear. The oldest person in the circle folded a shawl more tightly and said, "It does not move like we do. It moves like cold does when it comes and goes." The child nodded as if that answered everything. And somewhere high where the rock remembers river